Some names and details in this story have been changed for anonymity and confidentiality. Not all photographs are from the actual scene.
On October 16, 2013, a group of hunters in pursuit of prey entered a remote part of the Catskills forest known as the Black Log Tract. 12 miles from civilization, they spotted a strange structure, a fortified hunting tower with tightly boarded-up windows that stood 15 feet above the ground. After picking the heavy lock and opening the door, the men smelled the smell of decay. The beam of a flashlight illuminated a human skeleton in the corner, wearing the remains of a green uniform. It was Ranger Jose Sutton, who had gone missing exactly 2 years ago. But the real horror was something else. The entire interior wall paneling was covered with small inscriptions, scratched out by a belt buckle. It was the diary of a man who was left here to die, and he knew the name of his executioner. On October 14, 2011, the morning in the town of Phoenicia, New York, was unusually cold and chilling. A thick, sticky fog, typical of mid-autumn in the Catskills region, enveloped the valley, hiding the treetops and blurring the outlines of buildings. Local residents later recalled that the air felt heavy that day, as if before a thunderstorm, although forecasters had promised only light precipitation at night. At precisely 7:30 in the morning, the door of a house on the outskirts of town opened, and 31-year-old Department of Environmental Protection Ranger Jose Sutton stepped out onto the porch. Neighbors who testified to the police described him as a man of exceptional, almost army-like discipline. A former military man, trim, with an attentive and piercing gaze, he lived his work and knew this forest better than he knew his own living room. That morning, he was dressed to the nines, dark green cargo pants, a perfectly pressed gray uniform shirt with departmental patches, and a warm fleece vest to protect him from the morning dampness. Jose got into his official SUV, a green Ford Explorer, checked his gear, and headed toward the Slide Mountain Reserve. His task for the day was a routine inspection of the far reaches of the park before the official close of the tourist season. It was a routine procedure, inspecting the trails, checking the markings, and assessing the condition of the forest before winter. Nothing boded ill for us. Sutton made only one short stop on the way to the reserve. The surveillance cameras at the Mountain Peak fuel station captured his company car at 8:15. The grainy footage shows the ranger filling up a full tank of fuel. He looked calm and focused. A witness, a gas station cashier, later told investigators that they exchanged a few words about the weather and the upcoming hunting season. Jose bought a bottle of water, got in his car, and drove out onto the highway. At 8:45, his SUV crossed the park boundary and disappeared into the fog. That was the last time anyone saw Jose Sutton alive. According to the protocol, at 18:00, Jose was supposed to contact the control center for the evening report. However, the radio was silent at the appointed time. The dispatcher called Sutton's flight several times, but the only response was static. At first, colleagues assumed that the ranger could have been delayed in a zone of poor coverage, which happened in deep gorges. But when the clock crossed the 19-hour and 30-minute mark, the dispatcher officially sounded the alarm. Everyone knew. Sutton never broke protocol without a good reason. His silence could only mean one thing. Something serious had happened. The search operation began at dawn the next day, October 15th. The scale of mobilization was unprecedented for this district. More than 80 volunteers, professional rescuers, canine teams, and New York State police helicopters began combing the reserve square by square. The forest that Jose loved so much now seemed hostile and mute. The first find was not long in coming. Jose's company Ford was found in a small gravel parking lot near the beginning of the popular Wittenberg-Cornell Slide hiking trail. The car was neatly parked. The engine was cold. The doors were locked. When the police opened the car with a spare set of keys, they found the ranger's personal cell phone and his thermos of unfinished coffee inside. The fact that Jose had left his phone in the car while heading into the forest was extremely atypical for him, even given the presence of a service radio. The key to the investigation was the work of the search dogs. The dog handler brought the shepherd to the driver's door, letting it sniff the seat. The dog instantly picked up the scent. He confidently led the search team, not along the tourist trail, but to the side, to an old logging road that had long been overgrown with bushes and was not marked on modern maps. The group followed the dog for about 1.5 miles, deep into the forest. The tension grew with every step. The trail led to a remote and wild sector, where tourists almost never entered. However, near a fork in the road, not far from the dried-up bed of the Beaver Kill Creek, the dog's behavior changed dramatically. The animal stopped, began to whine, and circle in one place in the middle of the road. The dog did not lose the trail. It clearly indicated that the scent broke off right there, in the middle of the track. Experienced trackers immediately realized what this meant. The object did not disappear into thin air. Here, in this dead end, Jose Sutton got into another vehicle. The ground on the road was damp, but there were no clear tire tracks. The overnight rain that had fallen over the mountains had washed away all the details, turning the soil into a viscous mud. Forensic experts were able to capture only blurry outlines that indicated that a heavy vehicle had turned around here. Over the next 3 weeks, the forest was literally turned upside down. Divers checked mountain lakes, climbers descended into gorges, and volunteers chained themselves through the thicket. But no other traces were found, not a scrap of clothing, no lost equipment, no signs of struggle. The investigators' version of the story was that of a kidnapping or an accident, followed by the concealment of the body. But there was no evidence. Jose Sutton seemed to disappear in the cold autumn twilight. The operation was officially closed in early November. His family and colleagues refused to believe that an experienced ranger could simply disappear without a trace on his own territory. But the forest remained silent, reliably guarding its secret. None of the searchers then realized that the clue was much further away than they were looking for, and that Jose Sutton had not left the forest on that fateful day. Exactly 2 years have passed since the day the fog swallowed up Ranger Jose Sutton. During this time, the forest has managed to shed its leaves twice and be covered with snow twice, safely hiding its secrets under a layer of humus and moss. The search notices on the information boards faded in the sun, and the photo of the missing officer was gradually replaced by new ads. For most residents of the district, this story turned into another local legend about the dangers of the mountains, and only old case files in the police archive reminded them that a person cannot just vanish into thin air. On October 16, 2013, the silence of the reserve was broken by a group of 3 local hunters. They hadn't planned to go this far, but the wounding of a deer they had been chasing since the morning forced them to deviate from their usual route. The bloody trail led deeper into the thicket, into a remote and difficult part of the forest, known among the old-timers as the Black Log Tract. It was a wild forest zone where centuries-old spruce trees intertwined their branches so tightly that even at noon it was twilight. Here, 12 miles from where Sutton's abandoned car was found 2 years ago, even experienced rangers rarely ventured, considering the area unsuitable for patrolling due to the difficult terrain and storms. At about 14 hours and 15 minutes, one of the hunters stopped, noticing something unnatural among the dense thickets on the hillside. It was a geometrically regular dark spot that contrasted sharply with the chaotic lines of the forest. As the men approached, they saw a strange structure that resembled an ominous monument to human cruelty. An old hunting tower stood before them, blackened by time and moisture. However, it hardly resembled an ordinary shelter for shooting game. It was more like a fortified pillbox, raised on stilts 15 feet above the ground. The structure looked abandoned, but at the same time, impregnable. The wooden staircase that once led to the only door had long since been destroyed. The lower rungs had rotted away, and the upper ones had been deliberately knocked down. The narrow observation windows were tightly boarded up with massive boards, and, as it turned out later, both inside and outside. Curiosity and a strange premonition prevailed over caution. Using the climbing equipment they had with them to overcome the rocky areas, the hunters managed to climb up to the entrance. What they saw made them reconsider their understanding of the situation. The massive wooden door was locked from the outside, with a heavy padlock covered with a thick layer of rust. It was not a shelter from the weather or a temporary refuge. It was a prison. It took the men about 20 minutes to break down the lock with the tools at hand. When the heavy metal finally gave way and the door creaked open, a heavy, stale smell of dampness, mold, and sweetish decay hit them in the face. The beam of a powerful lantern cut through the darkness of the tiny room, which was no more than 6 square feet. Inside, there was a deathly silence. The beam slid across the plank floor and stopped in the far corner. There, on an old, mouse-eaten mattress, was a human skeleton. The body was in an unnatural, contorted position that people often assume when trying to keep the last crumbs of warmth. On the bones were remnants of clothing, in which the hunters were horrified to recognize the dark green uniform of the Department of Environmental Protection. Even after 2 years, the fabric retained its color, and the faded chevron of the Ranger Service could still be seen on the sleeve. An inspection of the room by the hunters before the police arrived revealed the horrific details of the prisoner's life. On the floor next to the remains were dozens of empty cans of beans and stew, as well as crumpled plastic water bottles. Their number indicated that the death was not instantaneous. The person locked in this box above ground had lived here for weeks, perhaps months. This was no ordinary murder. It was a long, methodical detention, designed to slowly fade away. The police and a team of forensic experts arrived at the scene only in the evening, as it was extremely difficult to get to the tract with equipment. Forensic experts, having examined the remains of clothing and personal belongings found in the pockets, preliminarily confirmed what everyone present had already guessed. The remains belonged to the missing Jose Sutton. The expert noted that the position of the body and the absence of visible fractures on the large bones indicate that the ranger did not die of a violent trauma, but probably from cold and exhaustion. But the most frightening discovery awaited the detectives when they began to examine the walls of the cramped cell in detail. Under a layer of dust and cobwebs, the wooden paneling hid a message. The entire interior surface of the walls, from floor to ceiling, was covered with small, uneven inscriptions. In the light of forensic lamps, it became clear that the letters had been scratched out with something sharp. As it turned out later, a service belt buckle and an ordinary rusty nail. It was not just a collection of words. It was a detailed diary of dying. Jose Sutton, realizing that he could not escape from this trap, methodically recorded every day of his imprisonment, turning the walls of his dungeon into a mute witness to the crime. The detective, who illuminated the far corner near the skeleton's head, shuddered when he read the last, barely visible lines. They were scratched deeper than the others, with the desperate force of a man who knows his time is running out and wants to leave one last piece of evidence against the one who condemned him to this martyrdom. Dear friends, before we continue to reveal the details of this gruesome case, I want to ask you a small favor. If you like such detailed investigations and would like to see more stories like this on the channel, please subscribe, click on the bell, and like this video. And also write any comment, even a few words or a smiley face. This sends a signal to YouTube's algorithms that the content is worthy of attention and helps to promote the video so that as many people as possible can see the story. Your support is really important for the development of the channel. Thank you. And now let's get back to the events at Chorney Log. The results of the forensic examination, which landed on Detective Mark Burke's desk a week after the body was found, shocked even experienced investigators. The analysis of bone tissue and organic residues showed something that was hard to believe. Jose Sutton did not die on the day he disappeared. He did not die a week later, or even a month later. Experts concluded that the ranger remained alive for at least 4 months after he was officially reported missing. This meant that while 80 volunteers were combing the forest, while his family was losing hope and his colleagues were writing sympathetic reports, Jose was just 12 miles away, fighting a daily battle for survival in a cold wooden box. The immediate cause of his death was not physical trauma, but a combination of factors: severe hypothermia and extreme exhaustion. He died slowly, in complete solitude, when the temperature in the mountains began to drop to critical levels in February 2012. However, the most important material evidence in the case was not the cans or clothes, but the prison itself. The walls of the hunting tower turned into a kind of chronicle of suffering. Detective Mark Burke, who personally examined the crime scene, later admitted that he was struck by the meticulousness with which the prisoner kept his notes. Jose, being a man of discipline, even in such inhuman conditions, tried to structure his time so as not to go crazy. He used the sharp tongue of his belt buckle and a rusty nail he found in the floor to scratch out words on unpainted wood. The first entries were clear and profound. They described a routine of horror. Day 12. He came again. He brought water and canned beans. He is silent. His face is hidden by a ski mask. He doesn't answer questions, just pushes the food through the hatch and leaves. I hear him check the lock twice. These lines showed that the kidnapper regularly visited his victim, keeping him alive, but at the same time, maintaining complete anonymity. This was not chaotic violence, it was cold calculation. Subsequent recordings became less legible, reflecting Jose's deteriorating physical and psychological condition. One fragment, dated mid-November, made detectives shudder. Day 45. I heard the sound of a propeller, a helicopter. It was flying very close, right over the tops of the spruce trees. I screamed. I hit the walls until my hands bled. But the insulation is too thick. Boards. Felt. More boards. They are looking for me. I know they are somewhere nearby, but they can't hear me. I am in a soundproof coffin. This detail explained why search teams working from the air did not notice any activity. The tower was perfectly camouflaged, and its design muffled any sounds from the inside. The hijacker had thought of everything. Toward the bottom of the wall, the handwriting changed dramatically. The letters became small, trembling, barely visible. These were the records of the last days, when the ranger's strength was leaving him and the cold was stifling his movements. The food stopped coming. Jose realized that he would not be fed anymore. He was left to die so that the forest could finish what it had started. Realizing the inevitable, he decided to use his last strength not to beg for help, but to expose it. He left a final message that became the key to understanding the motives of the crime. I know who it is. I've been thinking about it for weeks, analyzing every sound. I recognized his gait, heavy, with a pressure on his left foot, and the smell of his tobacco, sweet, cherry. I could smell it even through the cracks of the door. This is not a poacher or a random tramp. This is someone who wears a badge, someone I used to call my own. He is afraid. He's afraid that I'm going to tell about the northern quarry. These words turned the tide of the investigation. The secret that Jose Sutton took to his grave was a terrible truth. His kidnapper was not an external enemy. It was someone from within the system, a colleague, a man in uniform who was trusted. The mention of the North Quarry pointed to a specific motive. Jose had seen something he shouldn't have seen, and he paid for it with his life. Detective Burke stood in the middle of the cramped room, shining his flashlight on the North Quarry sign. He knew the place. It was an abandoned area on the edge of the reserve that hadn't been officially used in decades. But if Jose mentioned it before he died, it meant that something was happening there that was worth killing an officer for. Burke realized that now he would have to look for the killer, not among the criminals in the database, but among those with whom he shook hands every day. And the first step was to find out who in the department had been smoking cherry-flavored pipe tobacco. The mention of the Northern Quarry in Jose Sutton's suicide note was the missing piece of the puzzle that detectives had been searching for in vain for 2 years. For most of the county's residents, this place was just another forgotten dot on the map, an abandoned stone quarry on the outskirts of Hunter, which was officially closed in the 90s of the last century. Since then, nature has slowly but surely absorbed the remnants of human activity. Rusty crusher structures have been overgrown with wild grapes, and deep pits have been filled with rainwater, turning into dead lakes. However, for the investigation team led by Detective Mark Burke, the location now looked very different. After obtaining a warrant to access archived satellite imagery dating back to 2011, the investigators spent several days peering at the grainy images on their monitors. What they saw fully confirmed what the dead ranger had said. The quarry, which on paper was considered mothballed and dead, was actually alive with a vibrant nightlife. Images taken in the infrared spectrum in September and October of 2011 recorded the thermal signatures of heavy machinery. Trucks that were not authorized to be there regularly entered the quarry under the cover of darkness. In the high-resolution images, the analysts saw fresh ruts from wide tires and places where the forest was unnaturally thinned. This was not just random activity. It was a well-established logistics hub. Further investigation revealed the extent of the criminal scheme that was operating right under the noses of local authorities. The Northern Quarry served as an ideal transshipment point for a large network of illegal trade in natural resources. Here, far from hiking trails and patrol routes, the criminals stored valuable wood, black walnut and white oak, which are in high demand on the black market. In addition to the timber, investigators found evidence of industrial-scale poaching. In the old quarry adits, they found the remains of cages and traces of rare animals that were likely being prepared for export out of state. But the most disturbing aspect of the case was how the criminals managed to operate for so long and without being noticed. To transport tons of wood through the protected forest, it was necessary to drive through closed barriers, the keys to which were available only to Forest Service employees. Moreover, The analysis of documents showed that large-scale logging was disguised as official sanitary measures. Someone inside the system, a person with power and trust, signed permits to cut down allegedly diseased trees, thus covering up the theft of hundreds of thousands of dollars from the reserve fund. The reconstruction of the events of that fateful day, October 14, 2011, began to emerge with terrifying clarity. Jose Sutton, known for his meticulousness and integrity, probably noticed tracks of heavy machinery leading toward the closed quarry during his patrol. Being a man who was not used to ignoring violations, he decided to check a sector that was not part of his planned route. There he came across an active phase of loading illegal goods, or saw something that clearly indicated the involvement of his colleagues. He did not just disappear, he was eliminated as a dangerous witness. However, the murder did not happen overnight. Investigators assumed that the organizer of the scheme, the same man with the badge Jose wrote about, was faced with a difficult choice. Killing the officer on the spot meant leaving the body and a pile of evidence behind. In addition, the criminal needed to know whether Sutton had managed to pass the information on to someone else, whether he had made entries in his official journal, which was never found. That's why the old hunting tower in Chorny-Lose was chosen. This location was ideal, not only because of its remoteness. Only the old guard of rangers knew about the existence of this fortified pillbox. Those who had worked in these forests for decades and remembered the old hunting routes that had been closed in the 80s. The fact that Jose ended up there, and not in an unmarked hole in the middle of the forest, was direct evidence that his kidnapper knew the area like an expert and had access to old, unofficial infrastructure. Detective Burke realized that the circle was narrowing. This was no longer a hunt for an abstract criminal. They were looking for someone who had access to the keys to the barriers in the sector near the quarry, who could sign the sanitary felling certificates, and who knew about the existence of the secret tower. And most importantly, this person had to have been on duty the day Jose disappeared and participated in the search for him in order to lead the teams in the wrong direction. Burke ordered all the archives of duty rosters and signatures on felling documents for the year 2011 to be pulled up, looking for one particular name that could link the bureaucracy to the murder. After the decoding of Jose Sutton's dying messages, the atmosphere in the sheriff's department changed dramatically. If earlier investigators were looking for an external enemy, poachers, drug dealers, or random vagrants, now the investigation turned into a painful and tense process of finding a mole within the system. Detective Mark Burke understood that every step had to be taken carefully, because the suspect was not just a criminal, but an officer of the law, a person who knew how to cover his tracks and knew the methodology of police work from the inside. The circle of suspects was clearly and ruthlessly defined. Absolutely all employees of the ranger station who worked in the state in 2011 were under suspicion. These were the people with whom Jose shared an office, drank coffee, and went on patrols. To narrow this circle, the investigation brought in profilers from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The psychological portrait they drew up based on an analysis of the crime scene and the victim's notes painted an image of a man in power, confident in his impunity, and capable of cold, calculated cruelty. According to psychologists, the perpetrator suffered from narcissistic personality disorder. He considered the forest his property, his feudal fiefdom, where the laws of the state gave way to his own rules. This was a man who knew the area intimately, including forgotten trails and old infrastructure, and, most importantly, had physical access to the keys to the mothballed hunting towers. The killer did not panic. He acted methodically, turning the elimination of the witness into a lengthy process, demonstrating complete power over the life and death of his colleague. The attention of Detective Burke, who was reviewing personnel files at night, was drawn to a 45-year-old Chief Inspector Thomas Graves. This candidate for the role of the monster seemed absurd at first. Graves was not just a veteran of the service with an impeccable reputation, he was a living legend in the department, a mentor to Jose Sutton, the man who taught the young ranger how to read tracks and survive in the wild. It was Graves who personally supervised the large-scale search for Jose 2 years ago, coordinating the actions of volunteers and aircraft. However, when analysts overlaid a map of the search team's movements in 2011 on a map of the area, a disturbing pattern emerged. At the time, in the heat of the rescue operation, no one had paid attention to how Graves had divided the sectors. Now it became obvious. Every time volunteers or dog handlers approached the area of the black log tract, the senior inspector immediately changed their route. His orders were preserved in the protocols. Graves persistently, using all his authority, promoted the version of an accident. He convinced the headquarters that Jose had probably fallen into one of the deep stone crevices in the opposite part of the park. Graves declared the area where Sutton was actually dying slowly a closed zone. He cited the high risk of landslides and the impassability of the thicket after the rainy season. "I will not allow the lives of the living to be risked to find the dead." Graves' words at a briefing 2 years ago sounded like a cynical admission now. He was not saving the volunteers from danger, he was protecting his secret. But the final element that turned suspicion into certainty was a seemingly insignificant everyday detail. When interviewing former and current employees of the station, the detectives asked one strange question: which of their colleagues had a habit of smoking a pipe? The testimony was unanimous. Only one person in the entire department remained faithful to the old habit: Thomas Graves. He never parted with his carved pipe, filling it with a specific, expensive tobacco. Several witnesses, independently of each other, recalled a characteristic, sweetish aroma that always accompanied the inspector. It was the smell of cherries, a thick, cloying scent of flavored tobacco that would eat into clothing and linger in the air in the meeting room long after Graves had left. Detective Burke again pulled out a photograph of the inscription scrawled on the wall of the prison at Black Vine. Jose Sutton, on the verge of insanity from hunger and darkness, had retained the clarity of mind to record this olfactory evidence. The smell of cherries, sweet and thick. I can smell it even through the boards when he stands outside the door, listening to see if I'm still alive. He's smoking the same shit he does in the morning meetings, when he gives us our assignments. This is Graves. My teacher has come to watch me die. This entry left no room for doubt. The man who, 2 years ago, with a tragic face, comforted Jose's parents and promised to find their son, had actually come to him in the forest to make sure that the secret of the northern quarry was safely buried. Burke realized that the time had come for a direct confrontation, but he also knew that Graves was a cunning and experienced opponent who would not go down without a fight. He needed ironclad evidence, something tangible that would tie the inspector to the crime scene, because the smell of tobacco cannot be tied to a case. And the detective had an idea where to look for this last nail in the coffin of Thomas Graves' career. On October 18, 2013, at exactly 6 o'clock in the morning, the silence of the elite suburb where Chief Inspector Thomas Graves lived was broken by the screeching of police car brakes. The task force, consisting of homicide detectives and state forensic scientists, had a warrant for a full search of the suspect's home, service garage, and personal vehicle. It was an unprecedented step for local law enforcement to come to the home of a man who was considered a pillar of law and order in the neighborhood just yesterday. Graves himself met the law enforcement officers surprisingly calmly. Witnesses from among the officers who participated in the raid later noted in their reports that the inspector did not look like a cornered animal, but like a man who had been deeply offended by ridiculous suspicions. He slowly finished his morning coffee as he stood on the porch of his suburban home, and with a cold half-smile, he called the accusations against him the delusions of an inflamed imagination and a witch hunt that would cost Detective Burke his career. His confidence was so unwavering that some younger police officers began to question the feasibility of the operation. Graves was a professional. He knew how to find evidence, and he certainly knew how to destroy it. The search lasted over 8 hours. The forensic experts methodically checked every inch of the spacious wooden house, decorated in the style of a hunting chalet. They lifted the floors, tapped the walls, checked the ventilation shafts and the contents of the freezers. The garage was perfectly clean, with tools hanging in strict order and the floor washed to a shine. It seemed that Graves really wasn't hiding anything, or he had done a general cleaning with the thoroughness of a surgeon. The breakthrough came when the attention of one of the forensic experts was drawn to the old, massive fireplace in the living room. It was made of rough river stone and looked like it had been used regularly. The owner claimed that he burned wood there exclusively to create an atmosphere. A cursory inspection was inconclusive. The firebox had been cleaned. However, the instructions required a full inspection. The experts began to remove the ash residue from the deepest cracks between the bricks and from the ash pan, sifting the black mass through special fine sieves. It was a dirty and laborious job that seemed like a waste of time until the metal sieve made a distinctive ringing sound. Among the gray ash and coal dust, a small, smoky object glistened. When it was carefully cleaned with a brush, it became clear that it was a metal button. But it was no ordinary shirt or jeans button. The tarnished brass was clearly engraved with the coat of arms of the state of New York and the abbreviation for the Department of Environmental Conservation. It was a uniform button from a Winter Rangers jacket from 2010. It was the same jacket worn by Jose Sutton on the day he disappeared. An examination would later confirm that the metal had been exposed to high temperatures, but had not completely melted. Graves probably burned his victim's clothes in his own fireplace, believing that the fire would destroy everything. He didn't take into account that the high-quality brass used to make the uniforms could withstand the temperature of an ordinary fire. This small, burnt detail instantly destroyed the inspector's alibi. It was impossible to explain how an item of clothing belonging to a missing colleague ended up in the ashes of his home fire. While the forensic experts were packing the evidence in a sealed bag, the analysts in the department completed the verification of another critical data set. After obtaining a court order to access the details of Thomas Graves's phone connections for 2011 and the beginning of 2012, they overlaid timestamps on a cellular coverage map. What they saw resembled a jailer's duty schedule. The billing data revealed a clear, frightening anomaly. Every 2 weeks, usually on a Tuesday or Wednesday, Graves' phone would go offline. The digital silence lasted consistently for 4 to 5 hours. An analysis of the last connection points before the device was turned off showed that the signal disappeared in the same sector each time, at the edge of the coverage area, which bordered a dense forest. This was the exact area where the old, overgrown road to the Black Log Tract began. Graves, being an experienced operative, knew that the phone could be tracked, so he turned it off before entering the forest. But he did not take into account that the very regularity of these disconnections would create a virtual trail. The travel schedule perfectly matched the entries in the diary on the tower wall, where Jose recorded visits from his executioner, who brought water and food. The 5 hours of silence was exactly the time it took to drive the SUV off-road to the tower, deliver the supplies, make sure the prisoner was in place, and return back to the network. This mathematical precision turned circumstantial suspicion into mathematically proven fact. When Detective Burke came out of the house holding the bag of evidence, he looked at Graves. The senior inspector was still standing by the patrol car, but his arrogant smile had disappeared. His eyes were fixed on a small plastic bag with a piece of burnt metal glistening faintly in the sun. At that moment, something more than fear flashed in his eyes. It was the realization that his perfectly constructed fortress of lies had just crumbled into ashes. But even now, with his back against the wall, Graves was not going to give up without one last trick up his sleeve. On October 18, 2013, the interrogation room at the Greene County Police Department resembled a scene from a psychological thriller. Behind a metal desk sat Thomas Graves, a man who was considered a hero and a veteran of the service only yesterday. Opposite him was Detective Mark Burke. Between them, in a transparent plastic evidence bag, was a small, burnt piece of metal, a button from Jose Sutton's uniform jacket. This object became a point of no return. Graves stared at it for a long time, and gradually, the mask of the confident officer began to slip, revealing the face of a tired and cornered man. For the first 3 hours of the interrogation, Graves tried to maneuver, coming up with implausible explanations. But when the investigators showed him the phone billing, which clearly correlated with the entries in the victim's diary, he fell silent. The silence lasted for almost 10 minutes, and then Thomas Graves spoke. His confession was dry, devoid of emotion, as if he were reading out a patrol report, and this mundane tone chilled the blood in the audience's veins. It all started not with murder, but with greed. Graves admitted that he had been part of a corruption scheme for 5 years. He was covering a group of black loggers who were exporting valuable timber from the protected area through old roads near the quarry. For his silence and falsification of reports on sanitary felling, the inspector received a substantial percentage. The system worked perfectly until the human factor intervened. Jose Sutton, patrolling remote sectors, did not just see truck tracks. Graves said that the young ranger found a camouflaged cache in the forest, a plastic container hidden in the hollow of an old tree, where loggers left cash and invoices for Graves. Jose took the contents of the cache as evidence. He didn't have time to report it on the radio, but Graves, when he came to retrieve the money and found the cache empty, realized he was on to him. He knew who was patrolling the square. The reconstruction of the events of the morning of October 14, 2011, compiled from the killer's words, finally explained the strange behavior of the search dogs. Graves was not accidentally on Sutton's path. He knew his subordinate's route and was waiting for him at a fork in the dried-up Beaver Kill Creek. It was a meeting between a superior and a subordinate. Graves stopped Jose's car and asked him to get out to show him something important on the map. When Sutton approached, Graves pulled out his service weapon. At that moment, at a fork in the road, Jose got into his mentor's car at gunpoint. The dogs were right. The ranger's trail broke off right where he stopped touching the ground with his feet. Graves drove Jose's car to a tourist parking lot to simulate the beginning of a hiking route and locked it, leaving the phone inside. It was a cold-blooded staging. The choice of the place of imprisonment was not spontaneous either. Graves built the tower in the Black Log Tract with his own hands in the early 90s for illegal hunting. It was his secret place, his fortress, which no other living ranger knew about. He knew that no one would tread there because of the difficult terrain, and even if they did, they would not hear his screams because of the soundproofing he had carefully installed over the years. However, the most horrifying part of the confession was the motivation for Jose's prolonged detention. Detectives could not understand for a long time why Graves left the witness alive. The answer turned out to be cynical, to the point of being cynical. Graves didn't just want to kill Sutton. He wanted to destroy his reputation to save his own. The inspector planned to force Jose to sign a pre-prepared confession. In this document, Sutton was supposed to take the blame for organizing the illegal logging, saying that he acted alone, and that he was going to flee the country or commit suicide because of remorse. Graves brought him food and water, but each time he made the same condition: sign the papers and I will let you out. You will leave, you will disappear, but you will stay alive. He miscalculated only one thing: the character of his victim. Jose Sutton, exhausted, cold, locked in the dark, refused to play by the traitor's rules. He realized that even if he signed, Graves would most likely kill him, but then he would die as a criminal. Jose chose to die with a clear conscience. Day after day, week after week, he looked his former mentor in the eye and said no. The situation changed in January of 2012. Graves said that the snowfalls had become too heavy, and every trip to the Black Log was becoming risky. He also realized that it was impossible to break Sutton's will. The risk of exposure began to outweigh the benefits of a potential confession. Thomas Graves made a decision that terrified even seasoned investigators. He did not shoot Jose. He simply stopped coming to visit. His last visit was in mid-January. Graves didn't say a word. He simply checked the lock, made sure it was secure, got in his car, and drove away, knowing that he was leaving a man to die a slow and agonizing death from hunger and cold. He crossed Jose out of his life like a bad line in a report, continuing to go to work, smile at his co-workers, and even comfort the victim's parents on the anniversary of his disappearance. When Graves finished speaking, the room fell silent, heavier than stones. The investigator turned off the recorder. The inspector asked for water, but no one moved. Everyone looked at him not as a criminal, but as something completely alien to human nature. However, there was a trial ahead, and Graves, having recovered from the first shock of his confession, had already begun to think about a line of defense, hoping that his past merits would help him avoid the harshest punishment. He did not know that society, having learned the truth, was preparing a sentence for him that would be more terrible than any prison cell. The trial of former Chief Inspector Thomas Graves began in March 2014 and instantly became the most high-profile legal event in the county over the past decade. The county courthouse, which normally only sees hearings on petty theft and hunting violations, was surrounded by mobile television stations from leading national channels. Residents of Phoenicia and the victim's colleagues lined up at the entrance as early as 5 o'clock in the morning to get into the courtroom. For the local community, this was not just a trial of a murderer. It was a trial of a system that allowed a wolf to hide in sheep's clothing for years, wearing a badge of a nature conservationist. Over the course of 3 weeks of hearings, the prosecutor methodically laid out the chronology of the crime, relying on evidence collected by Detective Burke, from cell phone billing to the results of an examination of a button found in the fireplace ashes. Graves, who pleaded guilty during the investigation, chose to remain silent in court. He sat in the dock with a stone face, showing no emotion even when the prosecutor read out the decoding of the inscriptions on the tower walls. The defense tried to appeal to the defendant's psychological state and past merits, But these arguments were shattered after the testimony of a forensic psychologist who characterized Graves' actions as a manifestation of extreme cynicism and sociopathy. The verdict was announced on April 15, 2014. The jury took less than 4 hours to reach a unanimous decision. The judge, reading out the verdict, noted that Graves' crime went beyond ordinary murder, as he betrayed not only a specific person, but also the very essence of the service he represented. Thomas Graves was sentenced to life in a maximum security prison without the possibility of parole. As the convoy led him out of the courtroom, the former inspector looked up at the Sutton family for the first time, but there was no remorse in his eyes, only a cold emptiness. After the trial was over, it was left to decide the fate of the place that had become a tomb for Jose Sutton. The family of the deceased appealed to the state authorities with an official request to destroy the hunting tower in the Black Log Tract. They did not want this place to become an object of dark tourism or to remind them of the terrible months of their son's suffering. The court granted the request. In June of 2014, a special team of workers accompanied by rangers went to the tract. Since heavy machinery could not reach this remote slope, the dismantling was done manually. Witnesses to this process said that when the workers tore down the massive boards that covered the windows, a musty smell that had been preserved there for years escaped from the inside. The structure was dismantled down to the last beam, and the wood was taken away and burned at a special landfill, so that not even a single piece of wood was left of the dungeon. It was decided not to erect any pretentious monuments on the site where the tower stood. Jose's friends and colleagues brought a large, uncut granite boulder found at the foot of Mount Slide. They fixed a simple bronze plaque on the stone. There was no description of the torture or details of the crime, only a name, the date of life, and a short warning for those who dare to break the law in these forests. Even in the densest thicket, the truth will always find its way out. The final point in this story was put a year after the verdict, in the fall of 2015. Detective Mark Burke, who was already preparing to retire, decided to visit the Black Log Tract for the last time. He walked 12 miles to stand by the memorial stone. The forest around him had already begun to heal from the scars of human presence. Young grass was breaking through the ground where the tower piles once stood, and the silence was broken only by the sound of the wind in the tops of the fir trees. Burke took a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket. It was a copy of a photograph of one of the inscriptions Jose had made in his last days. This fragment was not in the general press, and only the investigators and family knew about it. The inscription was scrawled near the floor, where Jose probably lay remembering his past. The text, addressed to his father, a former military officer, sounded like the confession of a soldier who had done his duty to the end. "I didn't break, Dad. I did not sign their lies. I remained a ranger to the end." The detective laid his hand on the cold stone, paying his last respects to a man whose moral fortitude was stronger than the walls of a prison. The story of Jose Sutton was a grim but important reminder for the entire Department of Environmental Conservation and the people of New York State. It showed that the greatest danger in the wild is not a bear, a wolf, or the vagaries of the weather. The most dangerous predator in the forest has always been, and remains, a man with power, who is most afraid of losing his status and is ready to go to any lengths to hide his crimes. And although the wind continues to howl over the Catskills, as it did 1,000 years ago, for those who remember this story, its sounds will always echo the quiet invincibility of the Lone Ranger.